devices that could, if it were carried out effectively, destabilize a government.
And we saw some of that in the critical infrastructure case with the tsunami in Fukushima, which obviously was not an internet attack, but it reduced confidence in regulation.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to? Okay. Any other questions out there? Yes, there's.
It would be better if everybody took the stairs as a consequence.
Nothing like Shinjuku all the way up on the stair. Right.
Thank you. Paul Canario from the University of Toronto. Good to see you again, Jim. While we're talking about scenarios, and I'm struck by the use of the democracy index, the last one. And you've admitted or you've alluded to the various qualifications that maybe were put on that. But if we're looking at trust in government, there's a big correlation between the places where government is trusted, which have high scores, and the places where we would say government should not be trusted, which have low scores. Let us say that the government of the United States had to change 143 million Social Security numbers because of the Experian hack. And then there was an argument about, well, why did this happen and how does it get prevented? That might, this is a cyber issue, and there's probably a state actor hiding somewhere with 143 million Social Security numbers and enough to do identity theft and whatever. But you then get into an argument about, well, how does it do this? Who's to be responsible? How do you prevent this from happening again? Which would change the democracy index, given the nature of the current political system in the United States or the current political discourse. I'm just wondering if there's a way to, if the democracy, and I don't remember all the parts of the democracy index, but is there something that would capture some of the nuance of how the democracy index is vulnerable itself, in addition to what you've put on in terms of social media use? Because we now see that social media can be used to influence how democracy works. Maybe this is the wrong kind of seminar to ask that question, but I would have thought that the interaction of those two and then the role of government in either pushing it one way or pushing it the other would be a very interesting area for inquiry.
It sure would, and I admitted at the beginning, this is not much of it's not much of a theoretical model. It's an attempt to get some gross level of comparison. I think, now that you mention it, I think there's a sub-index, a component of the democracy index that is some kind of a measure of trust in government, but you've given me some homework to do, and I'll have to go take a look. Clearly, the model, that kind of a model is oversimplified and it limps. But we're trying to get our heads around, how do you compare? How do you do this kind of assessment across countries and ideally over time? And it's hard to get longitudinal, national level data that gives that kind of an indicator. So we're struggling with it, and I think we're going to struggle some more.
This is always a risky move, but there's a certain bête noire here that I have to express here. I've had my Social Security number stolen at least 5 times that I'm aware of, and probably many times that I'm not aware of. The problem is not that bad guys have my Social Security number. The problem is when a bank assumes that everybody who knows my Social Security number is in fact me, right? That if we have very low standards for authentication, we've got a bigger problem than simply a bunch of random Social Security numbers running around. And one of the things that we have failed to do as a society is, in fact, insist on relatively high degrees of authentication, partially because of our free market ideology. Even though it's the state governments that validate your identity using a driver's license and the federal government that validates your identity using a passport, we leave it to private enterprise to validate our electronic identity. And that's just nuts.
Okay. Let's see, we have way at the back. Alan, I think I see you in the darkness there. Yeah.
Alan Luxembourg from FPRI. James Lewis, you mentioned that to use the term cyber Pearl Harbor would suggest you don't know what you're talking about. So a brief Google search turns up a lot of illustrious people who have used that term. Leon Panetta, former Defense Secretary, James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander. So could you elaborate on that?
Sure, and you had the author of the Panetta speech speaking this morning, and afterwards I said to him, Eric, why did you write that? And he said, we didn't write it. He wrote it, he penciled it in. So the fact that you're an elderly statesman, or an elder statesman, I beg your pardon. Martin will know, we were at a conference in Tel Aviv where we saw an elder statesman talk about cybersecurity, and he essentially said that cybersecurity was like a banana, that we had to unpeel it. You know? And it's like, what the heck are you talking about, dude? So there's a imperfect correlation between political rank and general knowledge. So Panetta is of course brilliant. So I'm not being critical of him as a strategist, as a Secretary of Defense. He was great, but the fact that you say cyber Pearl Harbor means you haven't thought very hard about it. And one of the things I'm writing on now is how our perception is shaped to some extent by the experiences of the Cold War, where we got used to thinking in terms of catastrophe and nuclear catastrophe, which is real, and by the experience of 9/11, which was also a catastrophe, albeit on a much smaller scale. And so we have become a more risk-averse society. We've become used to it. Shodan, by the way, to build on this point, Shodan was a computer game. It's about 15 years old now, where, and you can type it into YouTube and you'll get a clip where it says, "Look at you hackers, you bags of meat and bone. How can you ever expect to defeat a perfect immortal machine like me?" Yes, it's another one of those Skynet, computer destroy the world, Godzilla, and even going back to Metropolis back in the 20s. And so we have this penchant for catastrophe in our popular literature that seeped into the public discourse. But that doesn't mean it's accurate, it just means it's fun. So Shodan, that's Shodan. Type it in, you'll have a lot of I've never played the game, I'd sort of like to, but I don't think it runs on current systems.
And I do want to be very, very clear that the device that we were using is not a game. It's a commercially available search engine.
Yeah, the guys who made the search engine named their search engine after the game because they loved it so much. And it is, check out the YouTube clips, they're kind of fun. But no, Cyber Pearl Harbor, it's like saying Cyber Manhattan Project. It's just another sign you haven't done the research you need to do to speak eloquently.
We're running up against the end of our panel here. I just wanted to throw one last thing out for responses. So you've taken us through a lot of the challenges and a lot of the problems of responses. So if you were to be allowed, sort of one or two recommendations of what the U.S. should be doing that it's not doing to cope with cyber threats. We've talked mostly about China and North Korea as the threats from Asia, but there are others as well. What would be at the top of your list?
Well, the Trump administration put out an executive order a couple months ago, it was in May, I think, that called for a number of studies on improving cybersecurity. And one of the studies was to look at how you could link deterrence and norms. There are norms for behavior in cyberspace. How you could link deterrence and norms to consequences. And so I believe that the administration is undertaking a study now to look at developing retaliatory actions for cyber incidents that are both painful but reversible, right? And that will send a clear signal that this is unacceptable. And if you're an old arms controller, as some of us are, you could think of this as populating all the rungs of the escalation ladder. So we need to develop the responses. What is the previous administration spent months or even years wringing its hands over, how do I respond to Sony? How do I respond? And a more detailed list of potential responses, if you would be useful. The legal terms are the terms that you might want to think about. These are countermeasures and retortion, which are principles in international law that involve responses below the level of the use of force. So I think that would be the best thing to do.
Air gap the critical infrastructure that used to run before there was an internet.
Okay, Jack?
I think we ought to be looking very carefully at authorities for, particularly for the defense, for defense organizations to get situational awareness, to be able to identify and declare that an attack is underway. It's a big problem. It goes to issues of privacy, civilian control of the military. It's a really hard issue, but it's one that we have to look at in the U.S. and our allies have to look at as well.
Well, thank you. That's a terrific set of notes to close on. I thank you for a really stimulating panel and just much depth of insight and much covering of the waterfront. Thank you for joining us, and please join me in thanking our panel. And now I believe we have lunch. Shoko, it's just across the way. Okay, the lunch is across the landing there. So please go get some food, and we'll have a luncheon keynote as well.
You mean there is such a thing as a free lunch?
Are you coming down to this, the West Point thing in November?
Well, for me, for them.
Okay.
Hi.
They used to do it all the time. Maybe it's now with their cyber. Oh, they're doing it with the